You'd think that having access to masses of information being generated by new technology would be a help for police. Images, social media, digital data, crime prevention should be easier. But is it taking officers away from their core roles? And with pressure on resources, is the data itself being analysed accurately? Information, of course, has always been a crucial part of policing. Now, in the past, that came from working in the community. But now, new technology means there's a huge swathe of data that needs to be collected and analysed. So, what does that mean for the men and women who are sworn to protect? The future of policing is big data. Surveillance sources, social media, facial recognition and digital maps of crime forecasts are some of the new tools being used to fight crime. But with police forces around the world reduced by funding cuts, do officers have the time to effectively analyse the swathes of data available? And what if the data is wrong or misleading, putting lives and liberty at risk? So let me introduce our guests today. Joining us on Skype from New York is John Eterno, Professor of Criminology at Molloy College and former NYPD captain. Here with me at the Roundtable is Boyd Mulvey, CEO of Chorus Intelligence, and Babu, former Chief Superintendent of the Metropolitan Police. Gentlemen, welcome to Roundtable. Dal, let me start with you, because 30 years in the force, you must have seen a huge difference in A, the kind of data, and B, how that's being collected.
Yeah, absolutely. I joined Tottenham Division, which is North London. It's sort of quite a challenging area. It's had a number of riots. The most recent one was 2011. I joined. I was there in 1984. A year later, there was the Broadwater Farm riot. So it's an area that's very, very volatile. Has lots of challenges at the moment. And I remember at the time when I joined, there was one man who was called the collator, and he had an assistant. And basically, what you did was the police officers would go on patrol. They'd write down something that they thought was interesting, and it would go in the parade book. And then the sergeant would stand up and read the parade book. It's vastly different now. You know,
so it was all handwritten?
All
How
handwritten.
on earth did you cross-check anything?
You didn't. It was down to individuals. So everything was on a card. You'd have a individual who was a villain. You'd write down what their vehicle was. You didn't really understand associates. You didn't understand where crime was necessarily going to happen. And when I remember one guy who was brought in to try and modernise it, he was seen as a bit of a bizarre geek, because he was suddenly looking at interconnections between individuals, connections, where crimes were happening, trying to anticipate where crime was going to happen. So that collator was the person who knew most of the information, stayed in an office all day, and actually when he retired, and it's often a job given to somebody who was near retirement, when he retired he disappeared, and a lot of that intelligence disappeared as well.
So 30 years on, clearly it's very, very different, and now we have, or should have, the ability to cross-reference information from all the different forces, because it's all digital.
Yeah, I mean, there's, in England and Wales, there's 43 forces. They'll all have their own intelligence system. There's an overarching. We've tried to emulate the FBI, which is a very, very efficient organisation, very, very well run. We've got the National Crime Intelligence. We don't really have that kind of strength of depth of working across different forces at the moment. So I think we've attempted to do that, but I think the biggest difference between it's almost 36 years ago when I joined to now is the electronic intelligence. So it's virtually everybody's got a smartphone. There'll be huge amounts of data on there, and we've seen in this country very recently in Britain a lot of cases collapsing where the police haven't shared the intelligence.
Right. And that's where someone like your company can come in, because what you do is help police forces analyse this kind of data. Tell me what exactly it is you do and how this relationship came about.
So Chorus Intelligence has a number of products. The two main products are Chorus Analyzer and Chorus Investigator, and they're targeted initially at the analyst because the data is concentrated historically around the analyst, because now all police forces generally have analysts, and they have access to all of this data. But it's very disparate. It's very incongruous in the way it's collected and meshed together.
So this is data coming in off different devices, phones, computers, social media.
Correct. It'll be open source social media. It'll be handset data, as mentioned earlier, call data records from the telcos, ANPR data from the cameras on the side of the roads, financial information from banks, covert information from informants, all digital data. So
I mean, this is massive.
It is massive.
A massive
yes,
amount
absolutely.
of information.
And in solving crime, the police have a great deal of information as to what's happened historically, as to whether or not people have been arrested and so on. But that won't tell you who actually was at the scene of the crime. That won't tell you how big the conspiracy-based crime. What I mean by conspiracy, I mean serious and organized crime, terrorism, drugs, guns, slavery, that sort of thing, where you've got people acting in concert. And it's those connections that, as it was being mentioned earlier, those connections collected from externally sourced data that helps the police uncover who was there, who was working in concert, and so on. And that amount of data is growing exponentially.
Right.
And so really you have to have software to solve that.
John, what is your concern about this collection of data and the type of data that's being analysed?
One of the major concerns with this is that information coming in is sometimes not culled, and it is not as good as it should be. So what we get is garbage in, garbage out, and that's a major problem. You're just analyzing whatever data that you have access to. With NYPD back in 1994, they started a system called CompStat. CompStat means compare statistics, and what they would do is look at their own statistics coming in. And this became part of the performance management system, quantitative data coming in, being analyzed by crime analysts. And it was really the beginning of the performance management era. This era, unfortunately, has led to a huge amount of pressure on commanders to make sure that crime is going in the right direction, that is, it's going down. And in fact, in New York, it's become almost an imperative for crime to go down. And on 2 separate surveys that I've done on New York City police officers, we've found that the data is actually being massaged. And this is the major concern that I have.
Massaged by who? By the analysts? By the police themselves?
Yes. In fact, they may not take the reports that they need to, or they'll change words on the reports to make it look better. So that, in fact, if you have, say, a rape, instead of it being recorded as a rape, it'll be recorded as something less, such as forcible touching or something of that nature. I've interviewed victims and others with this. It is a major problem for police departments because the police are being judged on those crime rates.
I think John's right. Sadly, I was a chief superintendent, a borough commander, when the powers that be decided that CompStat was a good idea and would be brought over to London. And basically you had 32 borough commanders in a room, policing 8.5 million people, and we were asked very, very detailed questions. So I think John's right. It's not the best way of analysing.
So how do you preserve the integrity of, because presumably there's always been pressure on police forces to keep crime figures down. So
I think in the past, I don't think there was the awareness of crime. So, I talked about the collator, I talked about how those systems were gathered. I don't think it was that sophisticated. I think it's more recently, and I think CompStat was the key element that was exported from America to Britain. And basically, the 32 borough commanders were held up. And I remember being in meetings where borough commanders felt so intimidated they couldn't speak because you had your finger pointed at you and you were asked about the intricate details of every single crime. I think that the challenge we now have is about restoring some faith in some of those statistics. I think we've had a real challenge. I'll give you an example of something that happened to me 6 weeks ago. I was walking along City of London area. We have so you have the Metropolitan Police, and then in the middle mile it's run by City of London Police. And me and a colleague of mine, we'd been to an interfaith meeting. He was a rabbi. He was wearing sort of rabbi attire.
Right.
We were walking across the road. The light, it wasn't in our favour, but lots of people were crossing over. A car, a black cab, started driving towards us. Didn't stop, actually sped up, and we had to jump out of the way. Now, a police officer came out because we had an altercation with this taxi driver.
Right.
And I explained to him what I thought of him and his driving, and we had some choice words. My rabbi friend, who's a lawyer, so I'm a former chief superintendent, he's a lawyer, he filmed it all. Police officer came out, spoke to us. The cab driver at that point had driven off, and the police officer said to us, well, you shouldn't have been crossing there, it's your fault. And I thought, well, that's a bit bizarre. So, you know, John's point there about police not wanting to take reports was quite accurate. Actually, we had a long conversation. I explained who I was. My colleague explained who he was. There was a little conflab, and he came back and says, "Oh, there may have been a crime here."
Right.
So I think,
and presumably those images that were taken on your friend's phone could be used as evidence if it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Further.
But I think,
So,
sorry, just to reinforce John's, I think the pressure is, and I suppose the point I would like to emphasise is that we've had huge reductions in the number of police officers.
right.
So we've had 20,000 reduction in police officers. When Theresa May, who's now the Prime Minister, was the Home Secretary, we've also had 18,000 reduction in police staff and community support officers. And those police staff are the ones that are incredibly skilled. They are the analysts. So the number of analysts that Boyd was talking about has gone down quite considerably.
So is this a massive problem, that there actually aren't physically enough analysts to do this side of policing?
Well, yes, is the short answer to your question. I think it's important to differentiate between the two issues that we're talking about here. First of all, the point made by our American colleague is about management information and performance statistics. And so that's one field of data, and that's how the police.
All right, well, let's start with that.
This is what you're talking about in terms of solving crime, which is actually the issue I think that we care about. Reporting on how many crimes there are is an issue, but that doesn't solve crime. And so, to address your question, analysts have been substantially cut in the UK. The numbers have been reduced by around 60% across all of the different forces, and the amount of data has gone up. So to put it into perspective, in one counter-terrorist investigation, 3 guys in a van driving towards Syria, I think it was a year ago or so, that one investigation, no threat to life, no arms involved, and there was more data created in that one investigation than all the counterterrorism investigations from 2008, 2009. So one relatively insignificant action by 3 individuals created more data than the entire counterterrorism police in the UK about 8 years ago. So that volume of data with 60% reduction in staff means that you've got basically a perfect storm. So, as I say, technology, as I mentioned earlier, is the only answer to this. The police are not going to be able to recruit.
Does that, is there a fear then that, as Dal was saying, you know, the number of police officers have gone down, that police are using more resources into analysing data than actually putting bodies on the street?
No, I think a couple of great examples on this would be, one, a covert team in a force in Northern England. They had maybe 40 officers, let's say. And the commander of that team was saying to me before they deployed our software, before they deployed Chorus in that team, those officers who were meant to be out essentially observing criminal activity and trying to gather evidence to convict, were sitting at their desk trying to analyze the data. Whereas if they put it into our system, as an example, or others, we can reduce from a month. It would take an analyst or an individual a month to get to a conclusion. Right. We can reduce that down to basically an hour. So that kind of cost savings or time savings will help the police to regain some of these cuts that have been employed.
John, do you agree with that? That using technology and systems to more efficiently analyse data is actually making policing more efficient?
Oh, yes, the need for software and analyzing materials is very, very important. In fact, the FBI now has a new position called analyst. They're not a special agent, and these are just people that work behind the scenes with various software packages. My major concern, however, is the data that's going into this needs to be looked at very carefully. And you can do all the analysis you want, but if you're looking at garbage, you're coming out with garbage. So you need to make sure that that data going in is proper and is right. And I've suggested, for example, integrity testing in police departments where
What about ethical and privacy issues over using this kind of information, and also even getting hold of it? Because a lot of these big companies like Twitter and Google are very reluctant to hand over this kind of information.
oh, and rightfully so. It would be a terrible business practice for them to give that information out freely to police departments and others. There is a privacy issue, and this is the tension that we're dealing with in our day. That is, national security versus due process and privacy rights. This is a public discussion that we have to have as to how far we're going to go in looking at people. Data is certainly there. There's no doubt about it. But how much the police and others who work with the police have access to that data is another question. And it's certainly something I think that I worry about as an American citizen. I don't want the FBI, the NYPD, and many other police departments having access to my private information. And this is something that is changing in our society due to technology. So there's sort of a double-edged sword. It's a positive thing with technology that we have all this information, but it's a negative thing in that the privacy issues for many people have become real and something that people are very concerned with here in the States, and I'm sure in other democracies as well.
I think the challenge there is that when we have an investigation and you need information quick time, you've got the big companies you've mentioned, sort of Google, Twitter, Facebook, put obstacles in the way of getting that information. So we've got a murder investigation at the moment in Southampton, in South England. Young teenager was murdered. The police want access to social media. The social media giants have refused that. So they're asking the police to go through the legal process. It gets more complex because it means that not only do they need to go through a complex legal process, but they need to do it in countries that are based elsewhere. Companies that are based elsewhere.
But clearly they're doing that because they don't want access to social media to be a free-for-all, even if it is for a murder investigation.
If any of your listeners had a relative who had been murdered or was seriously injured, you'd want that investigation to happen quick time. You wouldn't want shilly-shallying around going through processes. So I think what you need is the balance, but I think at the moment the balance is not in favour of effective investigations.
Right.
So the companies have put up a lot of obstacles because encryption is really important to them. Encryption means that they're able to sell their products more widely. I'm afraid they haven't got the balance right.
And that makes policing much more difficult.
Absolutely,
when you have
yeah.
encryption. I mean, how much of an issue is that?
Well, there's this adage in the police: just because you can, should you? And the police spend a lot of time considering these issues. And there's something in the UK called RIPA, Regulatory Information Powers Act, that is a legal framework for the police to access this data. And they use that, and there's processes for them to do that. And so eventually they will get the data.
But eventually doesn't sound as though it's happening quick enough.
Yeah.
Well, it can certainly happen faster, and there should be better frameworks for the police to access it, but there absolutely needs to be and should be oversight. So I would strongly advocate for the police to have access to all of the data that they need to solve the crimes. If to use an inflammatory example, if your son or daughter was abducted, would you want and somebody was seen abducting the child, and they were seen in a car, and that car was parked outside of a house, would the police or should the police have access to that house to search it to find or disprove whether the child is there? I think most people would say absolutely.
Yeah.
So
reasonable cause.
if a reasonable cause, exactly. So if those powers to search your house exist, how can
Then
it
why
be
not?
wrong that they search
Right.
your phone? It's absolutely ridiculous. So, but there has to be oversight. Snowden showed what happens or could happen when police have unfettered access.
Okay.
So there needs to be a framework.
Let's have a look at another aspect of this. Could you know, lots of big companies use analyzed data to predict trends. Can this kind of information be used to predict crimes? John, do you think we could use it that way in the future?
Of course, this has been done in the New York City Police Department for quite some time now. Hotspot analysis, crime mapping. These types of software have been used for many years and do help in predicting when and where crime is going to take place. There's a theory called routine activities theory, which helps us with this as well. And I do think that as long as the data is proper going in and it's accurate and timely, you will be able to predict to some extent. Of course, there's anomalies and other things that are going to take place, but yes, you can predict with some certainty.
I think that's really fascinating. That's like something out of a science fiction movie, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
How useful do you think that is?
You know, we have hotspotting here in this country. You have crime mapping. I'm not entirely sure it is as effective as it could be, and there's still some gaps. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a crime in that particular area. You can put resources in there. I suppose the difficulty is to make sure when you have these kind of systems that you've got checks and balances, when you've got information, so personal data is being shared. And we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica company how they've sort of abused the data sharing.
Sure.
So what we need is when we've got private companies involved, you know, Boyd's talked about RIPA, Regulatory Investigatory Powers Act, that affects legal public companies. But if you're a private individual, so for example, there's a big growth in India at the moment of private investigators, no regulation whatsoever. They can film what they like, they can do what they like. You know, so you need those powers there to have some checks and balances. I think what worries me is as the private sector grows and works with the public sector, we need to ensure that the data that they have is safe. We need to ensure that they follow rules and regulations.
Right.
And we don't have a situation where, with Cambridge Analytica, where data was used and unfortunately abused.
Presumably you can give these kind of reassurances.
So, absolutely. Just picking up on John's point earlier, the USP, if you like, of our software, of course, is that we actually cleanse the data. And when I started the company about 8 years ago, there was no uniform software which cleansed externally sourced data into the police, and the rubbish in, rubbish out, garbage in, garbage out, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. It's the same sort of thing. Data integrity for the police is absolutely key. So unless you're cleansing the data when it comes in, you can't use that data to convict. You can't use that data for analytics. You can't use that data for cross-border or cross-force sharing. When we started, there wasn't just no consistency across forces. There was no consistency between analysts on one desk and the other desk.
Right.
And so, unless you have that level playing field where everybody's using the same data cleansing process, then you can't really share data. And there's something in the UK called county lines crime, which is basically people in cities trafficking drugs and using children and so on in other counties. So to solve those crimes, you have to have cross-force collaboration. And in order to have that, you have to have those forces sharing data. And in order for that to happen, back to John's point, you have to cleanse the data at the way in.
And I suppose just add to that, if I may, because you then have other partners involved in trying to solve those crimes. So the county lines is a classic one where children are trafficked and then sell drugs in sort of rural areas from urban areas. You have children's services, you have social workers, you have local authorities, and their understanding of what is shared and isn't shared is different from the police's understanding. So it becomes incredibly complex.
Let me ask you this, as a former police officer, is there enough money to do all of this, analyse data and go through everything, and also have the very visible side of policing, which is Bobby's on the beat and reassuring the public? I mean, budgets have been cut for years.
Absolutely, yeah. No. I mean, the short answer is no. The money has just disappeared. So we've had that 20,000 reduction in police officers, 18,000 in police staff. So you have very, very skilled analysts. I should imagine a lot of them have gone on to work for Boyd's company. You have very, very talented individuals who are leaving the police, and then you have a PC trying to fulfil that role. You know, the police officers aren't trained. They don't have the necessary skills. You know, you need those analysts back. And I think it's the danger is that we can create intelligence packages for deploying people, for arresting individuals, which the analysts can do. I mean, I relied very, very heavily on our analyst team. They did a brilliant job. They were, they're worth their weight in gold. They really understood what the crimes were, where the trends were, and they were very, very effective.
But obviously choices are having to be made about where to put the money. We are running out of time. I just want to ask you one last question, John, very quickly. That recently the head of Britain's Crown Prosecution Service said the British criminal justice system is unable to cope with the huge amounts of data being generated by technology. Is that a view that's shared across the water there in the US?
Not really. I think the more information we have, the better. And I think that most police officers and analysts really want as much data as they can get. I think the privacy issue is more of an issue here in the States. Most people are very concerned, especially when private corporations start getting access to information on victims and other information, which really needs to be looked at very carefully before information is shared with a private company.
Well, some really interesting issues raised by that discussion. Thank you very much indeed to all my guests today. That's it from me on this edition of Roundtable. Till next time, bye-bye.